friends, welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I'm your host, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 240. Show notes are at vitaldescent.com/240. And on the line, I'm glad to be joined by Dave DeCamp. Dave, how's it going?
Good, Pat. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah.
I guess actually this is my first time on the new show.
I suppose it is. Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of new shows, you have a new show that is not quite as new anymore. But I should have brought you on earlier to talk about it. I've been meaning to, but you want to tell people about, first off, remind them who you are and what your new show is.
Yeah, so I'm the news editor of antiwar.com, and what I do pretty much as my job is I just write, kind of short news summaries every day for the page. If you look at antiwar.com and you see the top news section, a lot of those stories are from me. And I'm really just kind of immersed in U.S. foreign policy news. So because, I know everybody doesn't have the time to read or just doesn't, that's just not how they, like to digest their news and everything. I started a podcast, daily podcast. It's 5 days a week. It's called Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp. And really what it is, because I write, usually 5 or 6 articles a day is like my average these days. It used to be more before, we had a baby, but so it's a lot. And I figured, at the end of my workday, when I'm done writing, I just record a podcast and go over everything I've written, and then other stuff, from Kyle and Will or Connor at the Libertarian Institute, because they've been doing some good news coverage, and also Jason Ditz writes for us. And sometimes we just run articles from other websites that are good. And I just run down the news section, and I try to keep it like 20, 25 minutes. It runs a little longer now sometimes, but it's pretty short, and it's just a good way for people to stay informed on foreign policy from our, non-interventionist viewpoint. A lot of what I do really is kind of just take out, the spin from, the mainstream, just kind of extract the important stories, the important information that's like buried in a New York Times article, for example, or Washington Post. So that's a big part of what I do. And yeah, I think it's a pretty good resource. And actually today's episode was the 100th one already. So I've already done it quite a bit. It doesn't feel like I've been doing it that long, but I guess if you do it 5 days a week, what is that? Only 10 weeks. So it's not too much, but yeah, I think, if people want to stay on top of this stuff, it's a good way to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a massive output. I mean, when sometimes I struggle to put out one episode a week, and it's like, I know exactly how much it is in terms of work and time, but I'm sure, doing that, you find good ways to streamline the process as much as you can, but there's still the tedium of, recording, and then doing everything in one take, which is a challenge in of itself. And so there's all those logistics that people don't think about, like dropping the audio file in and uploading the video and stuff like that. So
yeah, it's what I do at the end of the day, because I put it out at like midnight for the next morning, and we post it at midnight. But I do it, I make it as easy as possible. Like you said, I just do it in one take. So I've been working on it. I think I've been getting better. It was a little difficult at first, there's no production into it. I do kind of want to make the YouTube channel maybe do an intro and just make it look a little better, get a better camera, things like that for production value that I think will help. But yeah, it's just and it's easy for me because I don't really need to prepare, because it's stuff I wrote about. When you write something, you absorb it in your brain a lot better than just reading it. So I just figured it would be easy for me to do, and it's worked out pretty good so far.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I think that, with me, I in some of my solo shows, I at one point had done a single take, but then you get, at least I do. I'm like, oh, that sucks, and I need to redo that. And then it just ends up taking forever to record and stuff. But no, and I think there is a lot to be said about writing a thing out and then knowing it a lot better too.
But yeah, and also, you're comparing yourself to me. I'm lucky enough that this is I'm able to do what I'm doing as a job and make a living off of it, enough of a living that I can do it full time. So, this is what I should be doing.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm glad it exists because, I don't know who it was, if it was Daniel McAdams, who said that basically what antiwar.com is an intelligence briefing for Congress. And was it I don't know if you heard Daniel say this or if it was somebody else who said this, but he said that when he was staffing for Ron Paul, all he would do is print out, the daily articles from antiwar.com, and Ron would be the most informed person during his committee meetings. So
yeah, that's so awesome.
So basically what your podcast is like, the daily briefing maybe a congressperson or a president would get or something.
Yeah, it's the non-interventionist version.
Yeah. And I always enjoy that too, because you read through your stories, and I don't know if there's something about Israel making an accusation or something like that. There's always the line that's like, now remember, Israel has been bombing Syria over and over again, or they're doing these assassination campaigns in Iran. So,
yeah, it's important context, especially with Iran and Israel. That when it comes to context, that's kind of the most important, because you have, and Jason's actually really good at this because he knows a lot about nuclear stuff. Like there'll be a story about how Iran's increasing uranium enrichment or increasing its stockpile, and it gets recycled. Iran announces it. It's a story. And then the IAEA confirms it. That's a story. And then Israel, says something about it. So it just makes all these headlines. And then really what it is, there's no proliferation risk at all of the stuff they've been doing. And Jason's really good at explaining that, kind of dumbing it down. And because it's so right now they're enriching some uranium at 60%, which is a higher level than they've ever done, which they did directly in response to Israel, attacking their nuclear facilities. But it doesn't matter how much 60% uranium they have stockpiled. It's useless. They need 90% to make a bomb. But they still make it like this big deal that they're doing it.
And there's always the remember too that was it the State Department who admitted that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear bomb, but yet they still keep employing the same policy against Iran.
Yeah, they keep making these threats. And the Pentagon, it was the Pentagon's nuclear posture review. It says in there that Iran has not made a decision to build a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. And so, adding that context really, it kind of provides the whole picture. It's like, in some way the mainstream media lies by omission more than they do anything else. Yeah.
And also just the fact that Israel has nukes,
right.
They're making all these threats. They always say, you see Israeli officials say, oh, if Iran gets nukes, then it's going to start a regional arms race. But Israel already has them.
Yep.
And it's a secret program. It's exactly what they accuse Iran of, but nobody seems to care about that.
Yeah.
And those were the things when I first kind of started, waking up to all this stuff, it was learning things like that really woke me up, I guess. Just that fact that Israel has a secret nuclear stockpile and we're not allowed to talk about it.
And I remember another formative event for you was that school bus strike. I think it was in Yemen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a big one for me. I mean, the thing that got me into all this, I was always anti-war. And it was the 2016 election. I remember it was both sides to me were just full of it. You had Trump. They were criticizing Trump for kind of nonsense while he was saying he was going to kill terrorists and their families. And that was the stuff, I was worried about. And then he went ahead and did that. And then you have Hillary, she's a total warmonger, but that's not really what the criticism of her was. And then it was when Russiagate was going on and all this stuff was happening in Yemen, and the school bus bombing in 2018, that got a lot of attention because it was so horrible. But that was just one of many, Saudi airstrikes on civilians and children in Yemen that were happening, and it just wasn't being covered at all by the mainstream media.
There was I did a recent interview on the Four Horsemen with Reed Coverdale and Eric Jackman and Ryan Dawson on there, and Ryan was talking about how basically the truth is what, if lies start these things, then the truth is what can end it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
If lies start the wars and all the violence, then the truth coming out is what ends it. And as you and I are both parents, thinking about putting yourself in the other position and having a child that goes on a field trip or a child that, is just trying to commute to school, and there's a bomb that comes in from a country on the other side of the world that just wipes them out. Imagining that situation where, you know, maybe you go to the scene of what happened and trying to identify your child's body from the smoking hull of a school bus. It's beyond imagination, but at least you can, when you have that information and know that that happened, you try to get some kind of empathy, sympathy.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, you know, I can't imagine what, you know, the parents are going through in war zones. Not since I've had a kid. My son, you know, he's only 13 months old, but it really has changed my perspective. And, you know, that's the famous Julian Assange quote: if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started with the truth. I don't know if that was exactly it, but, you know, I think that's just such a powerful quote. I think that's why WikiLeaks is so important. And another thing with having a son now, like, you know, when we're talking about this great power competition, you know, if World War III does, you know, break out, you know, it'll probably happen. I mean, it could happen sooner than I used to think, but, you know, really 10 to 20 years from now, if we keep going down this path and it doesn't go nuclear right away, you know, they're going to want bodies to be on naval ships, and they're going to try to draft, you know, our kids. So I think that's another reason why we really need to oppose all this brinksmanship.
And that was one of the things that you really opened my eyes about, was the great power competition and in this new Cold War that we've kind of that the public has slept walk into, but the, you know, the people in positions of power have pushed and pursued this policy over, I mean, frankly, for the last 3 decades, but it's really come to a head. And I suppose one thing is, I think you and I are both surprised at how quickly things have really deteriorated specifically in terms of U.S.-China relations. I mean, of course, we have the situation in Ukraine and with Russia coming to a head, but we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of that. But now it seems, and I wrote that piece about, you know, Lindsey Graham and Bob Menendez being architects of both situations and really trying to turn Taiwan into the new Ukraine.
Yeah, well, and that's their plan. And so if you see what Congress is trying to do right now, you know, they're working on the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, which is the military spending bill. And they're trying to insert $3 billion per year in annual military aid for Taiwan, which is totally unprecedented. And they're trying to do it in 2 ways. So they have this $10 billion from the Taiwan Policy Act that they passed. And that's in State Department foreign military financing, which is they give them the money and then they could buy U.S. weapons. So that's going to be over 5 years. So there's $2 billion a year. And then the other $1 billion is what they call this Presidential Drawdown Authority, which is mostly how the U.S. has been arming Ukraine. It allows the U.S. to take weapons straight from its military stockpiles and ship them to Ukraine. Well, this will allow them to do that, but with Taiwan for $1 billion a year. So they're trying to arm Taiwan the way that they're arming Ukraine. And you see the rhetoric from Menendez and from all these senators and China hawks, and they're saying, oh, we need to start arming them now. You know, that's the lesson of Ukraine, not that we were too involved in Ukraine, that we weren't involved enough, that we need to start sending them, you know, all these weapons now. And especially now that a blockade is more on their minds, since Pelosi, after her visit to Taiwan, China simulated a blockade around the island. And so what would the U.S. do in that situation? They're not going to be able to get weapons in there if the island's surrounded by Chinese ships. So that's their whole plan. And there's also this huge backlog in U.S. arms sales for Taiwan. It's something like $19 billion in weapons that the U.S. still needs to deliver. So they're all scrambling on how to get all these weapons to Taiwan right now. And at some point, you know, this support is going to become intolerable for China. And it's just a matter of when that is. At what point will they say, all right, that's enough, and either, you know, blockade the island or do some kind of attack, or who knows exactly what China's first step would be in that regard. But, you know, this is what they're playing with.
Did you had kind of mentioned the status of the Taiwan Policy Act, and I haven't been watching it as closely in the last month, but did you say that the Policy Act was passed?
So the Taiwan Policy Act was only passed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And they're trying to insert it, just the military aid part of the bill, into the NDAA. So then the other aspects of it, like making Taiwan a non-NATO ally, not officially, but they would give them the benefits of being a non-NATO ally. And then the other sanctions and stuff that are in it aren't going to be included in the NDAA. So they'll probably try to make a separate bill for that next year. But yeah, they're just trying to, well, they actually increased the military aid. It was $6 billion when they passed it in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and now it's $10 billion. And then plus the extra $1 billion each year now they're trying to give them too.
Okay, yeah. And that was roughly my understanding. I just didn't know if anything had happened, in terms of, do you know when the NDAA is going to be up for a vote?
Should be this week. That's what the reports I read said. And so Biden, I forget the exact number. I think he requested $813 billion, and it's going to be $858 billion. So a $45 billion increase from Congress. That's just like the new thing now. Same thing happened last year. Congress gave him a huge increase. But apparently they're worried with the Taiwan stuff about that it's not going to make it past the Appropriations Committee because it wasn't in the original NDAA. So they're going to have to make some cuts. But they're saying that, if the Taiwan aid does not get included in the NDAA, the White House could ask Congress to authorize it as emergency funds, which is how they've been arming Ukraine. The Ukraine aid has been emergency authorization. So again, it's just that attitude. And all these big things that they're doing, like they're also trying to give the Pentagon wartime purchasing power so they could buy weapons much faster and they don't have to, put out bids for contracts and things like that, just to shorten the timeline. And if you read these reports and what people in Congress and sources talking to the media are saying, they're like, well, this is about Ukraine, but it's also about preparing for war with China too, preparing Taiwan. So, it's very much about that. Even as they're shipping all these weapons to Ukraine, they're still making clear that China is the priority. Yeah.
And these parallels just keep coming into my mind. And of course, I've written about it before and you've written about it, but these parallels between the policy positions and even some of the key figures in shaping our Ukraine policy, shaping the Taiwan policy at the same time. It's easy to point out or to identify.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see a lot of again, it's that talking point that, they didn't do enough for Ukraine. It's kind of like how they always say, the U.S. didn't do enough in Syria, like Obama should have just bombed Assad directly when he said he was gonna, the red line and all that. So, there's never any kind of lesson learned from the intervention, the U.S. interventionist policies. It's always that, we didn't intervene enough. And that's just the mindset. And it's just a really, really dangerous mindset. Yeah.
So another thing that has happened is the Kuomintang has won a bunch of seats. And I haven't followed this as closely as I would have liked to in the last couple of weeks, but it's been pretty unreported, is that the opposition party in Taiwan, the Kuomintang, which used to be the primary party in Taiwan, actually has won a bunch of seats in Taiwan. And I'm not clear on what Tsai Ing-wen, what President Tsai's, what her position change has been. And hopefully, do you know?
Yeah, so she just resigned as the head of her party, which is the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. And what they lost in local elections. So like the mayor of Taipei is Kuomintang now. But if you look at a map of Taiwan, like the districts, like the Kuomintang won pretty overwhelmingly. And, it was Tsai and her party were trying to make these local elections about China, about like the threat from China. And that just didn't work. And everybody, didn't really vote for them. But the people that they voted in these local elections, they're not, it's domestic policy that they deal with. So, the question is if the China threat would still work for, the next presidential elections. Because she's still president. It's not like she resigned. I think that's in 2026 is their next presidential election. So for positions like that, that'll really be the test to see what the people of Taiwan are thinking when it comes to China. And it is interesting how the Kuomintang is more friendly to Beijing, and that they believe in the one China policy in their own way, in the fact that they think they still hold on to the idea that they should rule mainland China. Now, I don't know what their attitudes are, if they really think that's realistic, but it doesn't seem like it, because then they probably wouldn't be friendly to China. They would be more friendly to the U.S. And that's another thing the Kuomintang is doing, is that they're trying to rebuild their relationship with the U.S. They just reopened like a representative office in Washington. So, they're not as close. It seems like the U.S. would prefer the DPP to stay in power. So that's another thing. We'll see how with the upcoming presidential election, how the U.S. responds. Maybe it's 2024. I gotta look that up when the next election is there.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the relationship is with. Is it the party in power in Taiwan that desires closer relations with the U.S.? Like, is the Kuomintang just playing off of maybe what they see as a foothold with popular sentiment, people locally being upset with the brinksmanship? Or is it, like a similar situation in the United States where nullification, this idea that states can nullify federal laws they don't like, while they only support it, like if states are out of power and they don't like a policy the federal government has passed, all of a sudden they believe in nullification. But if they're in power, then they don't believe in nullification. And I wonder if this secessionist independence mindset is similar in Taiwan. Who knows?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And, I wonder how people feel about how, Nancy Pelosi came to visit and then left behind this mess of China doing these huge drills and shooting missiles over Taiwan. Maybe that has changed some people's perspective on what they want, when it comes to the relationship with China.
And you have it's kind of like, it seems like war, where you have this generational problem. And I mean, I guess I've talked on this show with Prof. CJ about this generational cycles. This, I forget what the theory is called, but it's like once all the people alive now living have died off and no one remembers what it was like to actually fight a major war, that's when you have new major wars happening, because they don't have that check. But I guess in Taiwan, you had the 95, was it 95, 96 crisis? But you have a whole new generation that hasn't experienced that. I mean, that was 25 years ago, it seems like. Longer math.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say, looking, if they consider that the third Taiwan Strait crisis, I guess it lasted for longer than what China did after Pelosi visited. But again, it was unprecedented what they did. So shouldn't that be the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis? Just the fact that they were shooting missiles over Taiwan. I think that's pretty huge, and simulating a blockade. So maybe that just kind of woke some people up to what the independence, close ties with the U.S. will mean, because if a war starts and the U.S. doesn't intervene directly, it's going to be, the Taiwanese doing the fighting and dying, just like the Ukrainians. So you'll have to keep that in mind.
I really expected it to last longer. I know that when it first happened, I had a tweet about how I thought, it would be something that lasted for months. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, because the 95 crisis, there was a lot of, maneuvering of ships and things like that, and shooting missiles off the coast of Taiwan. But at the same time, though, we do have a new level of militarization in the region. I believe so. And that is it the sorties, the Chinese warplanes towing the median line still? Yeah. So they go across it. So the median line, it's a line that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And it was actually drawn by the U.S. in the 1950s.
And China used to never cross it really. They started doing it a little more frequently towards the end of 2020 when Trump sent some high level officials. He sent his health secretary, which was the highest level cabinet official, U.S. cabinet official to ever go over there. And that's when we saw, these flights in the Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADIZ, really step up. But those weren't really close to the island of Taiwan if you look at where the planes are actually flying. But there were a few more flights across this median line, but only like a handful, like a dozen in 2 years. And then Nancy Pelosi goes to Taiwan. And before she went, I remember reading in the South China Morning Post, analysts saying, if she goes, these flights over the median line are going to become a regular thing. They're going to become the new normal. And Pelosi went, and they were right. They now fly over this line just about every day. It looks like it might have cooled off in the past just week or so. But in August, there was 300 Chinese sorties across this line. And between like the 1950s and 2020, there was like 5. So this is new pressure that they're putting on Taiwan, thanks to Pelosi going over there. And I guess it's not as provocative as just warships in the Strait firing missiles, for a few months. But still, it's definitely significant.
In another significant kind of development as we've been tracking, and I remember the first time we spoke together and I interviewed you, we were talking about the evolving trade war between the United States and China. And I think a month or two ago, you sent me this article in the Financial Times, I think it was, talking about the kind of the CHIPS Act, but there was also another, I don't remember exactly what it was, but was it something about sanctioning Chinese companies like Huawei, if I'm pronouncing that right?
Huawei.
Huawei. Wow, that's embarrassing.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But so I think that was a foreign policy article, and the title really got me. It was like Biden is all in on taking out China, and it really detailed these economic sanctions that they've just put on China, targeting their chip industry, which has resulted in a lot of American companies having to leave, and China kind of struggling. The U.S. is is restricting exports to China, certain advanced things that they need to make certain types of chips, which I don't know enough. I need to learn more about the specifics when it comes to the chips and semiconductors. But according to industry people, what Biden did is a pretty huge deal. And what the U.S. is also trying to put pressure on Japan and the Netherlands, because they have what China wants in these components that they need for chips, and they're trying to get them to ban the exports too. And initially, one thing Biden's sanctions on chips in China did was really spur a lot of investment inside China to make more of these components. And so that kind of had the reverse effect. China might actually become more of a chip producer. But then these latest ones that he did apparently are doing a lot of damage to that effort as well. So yeah, they're pretty serious sanctions. And it's tougher than anything, Trump ever did. And all the sanctions are still in place. So it just goes to show how much the economic pressure is ramping up. And then the CHIPS Act, that's more about becoming less reliant on, Taiwan. And I think they're trying to entice more Taiwan's chip companies to invest more in the United States, to open new facilities. So yeah, there's just a lot going on that front.
And the other front too was the deployment of these, I think, was it B-52 bombers to Australia? And I made a segment about that, and there were a lot of people in the comments talking about how, this is nothing new, that there's always been B-52 deployments to Australia, which I don't know the context enough to say that. And like you hate to be alarmist because you don't want to overplay what's happening, but at the same time, you noticing the escalations, and experts notice the escalations. But I think the main difference here was that these are permanent facilities that will be hosting these bombers in Australia.
Yeah, well, what they're doing right now is building these facilities. They're like extending runways and stuff, and facilities for them to be stored in. Well, it is significant because it's part of this AUKUS defense pact that the U.S. signed with Australia and the British. And that deal really focuses on technology sharing. So Australia is supposed to get the technology to make nuclear powered submarines. But part of it, when they signed it, Australia and the U.S. said that there's going to be more U.S. deployments to Australia, more aircraft, more troops into Darwin, which is in the north there. And that's where these bombers are going. There's already U.S. Marines have always rotated in and out of there, but there's going to be more. And yeah, the bombers, it's all part of the, Asia Pacific buildup. The U.S. wants to build up much closer to China, but they're having some difficulties with finding a place, although it looks like they're going to be expanding a lot in the Philippines. But yeah, when it comes to Australia, I think, there's no doubt that this is about China. That's what they are saying explicitly, that all the specific efforts in the Pacific are about countering China in the region.
And so there was another kind of spat over the Spratly Islands too, and that was involving a Philippine vessel? Or am I
yes,
the story
this
wrong?
was kind of weird. It was actually while Kamala Harris was in the Philippines, so she went over there and she met with Marcos Jr., the president, whose dad was president back in the day. And while she was there, she reaffirmed that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. So what she's saying, and what the U.S. always says, is that, if a Chinese ship or boat fires on a Philippine vessel, the U.S. will intervene and go to war with China over this dispute in the South China Sea. And then while she was there, this seemed pretty minor. I think maybe it just made the headlines because Kamala Harris was there talking about this stuff. Near one of these disputed reefs, a Philippine vessel was towing some debris that they found. Apparently it was like a Chinese rocket debris. And then a Chinese vessel came up and took it. And then the Philippines say they took it by force, like cut the tow line and all that. And then China says, oh no, we had a nice chat, and they handed it over. So who knows? But those things do happen, those encounters. And it shows, like it is a tripwire for a conflict with China. If we're really going out there and saying we'll come in and defend the Philippines, that might make the Philippines a lot more bellicose toward China in the region and more aggressive toward Chinese vessels. So, and then she actually went to Palawan, which is a Philippine province on the South China Sea, and gave a speech aboard a Philippine Coast Guard vessel, and saying all this stuff about China. She actually didn't mention China by name, but it was very clear that's what she was talking about. So, that sends a pretty serious signal to everybody, to China and the Philippines and other countries in the region, that the U.S. is very involved in this dispute. And she also was there to talk about expanding U.S. military facilities in the Philippines, which, according to Philippine authorities in Subic Bay, which is a bay on the South China Sea, it used to be the site of the largest U.S. naval base in Asia, which, it's huge. I used to work on boats and on ships and that in the maritime industry, and I worked with a lot of people in the Navy. I always heard stories about Subic Bay. Like, it's a very legendary place for American sailors and seamen, that, merchant sailors as well. So just the fact that the U.S. is going back there, it's not for sure yet, but the authorities that run the port are saying that it's probably going to happen, is very symbolic. And it also will give the U.S. a big military foothold right there on the South China Sea. Because right now, when they send ships there, they come from Tokyo, not Tokyo, wherever the 7th Fleet is based, which is in Japan. I'm not sure if it's in Tokyo or what city it's near, but so they come all the way from Japan. They go through the Taiwan Strait, they float around the South China Sea, and then they go back. So if they have a big base right there, it'll be a pretty big game changer for this whole standoff between the U.S. and China in the South China Sea.
So more big picture, one of the questions is by some realists, maybe I hope I'm not misidentifying, but I've noticed an argument that I attribute to some realists, that they say, well, the United States really does have an interest in Taiwan's security because Taiwan is basically a huge thorn in the side of China. It's definitely a strategic foothold. Like, I don't think anyone could deny that militarily, if you were going to go to war with China, it would be good to have, Taiwan as a forward base of operations, or have them on your side at least. But do you have any thoughts about that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because people like, John Mearsheimer, who's so good on identifying, what's caused the war in Ukraine and why it happened, and he recognizes that Taiwan to China, they're never going to give it up. Like, it's a total red line for them, just like Ukraine is for Russia. But he still thinks that the U.S. should, defend it from China. And I know a few years ago he didn't think that. I guess he's changed his mind recently. But I would say, from a realist perspective, looking at Taiwan, it's pretty clear that the U.S. doesn't have the capability and would waste a lot of resources trying to defend Taiwan and turn it into the porcupine, that they want it to be. That's what the term they use for, they want to turn it into a porcupine that can't be invaded by giving them a ton of weapons, selling them a bunch of weapons, when the U.S. could just focus on other areas instead. And it's also clear to me, and a lot of people that can call themselves realists ignore this, the fact that what the U.S. is doing is making a Chinese takeover of Taiwan by force, or an attempt at least, more likely by taking the steps that they have in the past few years. So maybe really, they might actually want, if they think China is such a threat to the United States' interests, maybe they actually want to bog down China in Taiwan like Russia is in Ukraine right now. Maybe their worldview is more nefarious than we think, just because they're good on Russia and Ukraine. So yeah, I don't understand the argument. There's this guy, I think his name is L.B. Colbridge. I might be getting that wrong, but he, considers himself a realist, and he actually helped draft the 2018 National Defense Strategy that the Trump administration put out that kind of declared that the days of counterterrorism are over. They're not over, but it's not the focus anymore. It's great power competition with Russia and China. And he is very I think, he thinks the U.S. should be doing everything they can right now to prepare for war over Taiwan. He thinks the U.S. should be involved. And, I just don't get how you could say that's a realist point of view when the U.S. and China can never go to war. It should be avoided really at all costs. And giving up Taiwan, it's not even so much giving up Taiwan. If the U.S. really kept the policy the way it was, I think that would do enough to prevent, China from taking the island by force. Or so I just seem like the big thing that the realists are missing, whether purposely or not, is just how what the U.S. is doing right now is so provocative toward China, and they're not going to sit back and let it happen.
I've heard some people say that, well, we shouldn't have an all-in policy for Taiwan, and we shouldn't make security we shouldn't do away with strategic ambiguity, which in my opinion, strategic ambiguity is not ideal from a pure non-interventionist perspective. But I think effectively from a realist standpoint, it is the dual deterrence is a cogent strategy. It makes sense. But what I try to argue too is because some people will argue just, well, we should sell them weapons, and that's all that we should do. And it shouldn't be an extravagant amount of weapons that are provocative, but we should keep doing it. And I think that the joint communiques, it was either the joint communiques or some other policy, U.S. policy, said that, well, we promise China that we will sell Taiwan weapons, but we won't sell Taiwan more weapons on net than we do to China, so that they're not gaining a strategic advantage. But my argument, I guess, from a real perspective is, how do you limit weapons sales to Taiwan realistically? Because you have these entrenched interests and you have these lobbying firms, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube once all this money is involved. And I think that in some way it's either all or nothing, and thinking that you are going to limit it at a certain point is more utopian than thinking that you could just cut off arms sales altogether.
Yeah. Well, and the people that argue for kind of continuing the status quo, some arms sales, I mean, that's just not what's happening anymore. Like, there's been a very clear change. And I think those who make that argument don't understand that, or are just ignoring what's been happening. There's just very clearly been a shift in U.S. Taiwan policy. I mean, U.S. officials have said so. So, yeah, I mean, I think, again, because I have to look at this stuff not just at a non-interventionist way, libertarian way, like, oh, we just shouldn't be involved over there at all. You have to think about realistic approaches that the U.S. could take with, just the way things are today. And yeah, limiting it right now. I mean, I have a really pessimistic view about this whole issue. I don't see anybody coming in and saying we have to stop selling weapons to Taiwan, or even trying to scale it down at this point. I mean, actually, Rand Paul did argue against the Taiwan Policy Act in a really good piece at the American Conservative.
Yeah. And
basically he did recognize that that they're changing everything. So maybe there's some hope there with him, because he has become more popular with his Fauci confrontations. So maybe he can get it out there. Who knows what the presidential run is going to look like, but he usually tries to throw his hat in the ring. But I doubt, if he's trying to make it as a real contender in the Republican Party, I actually doubt he's going to make that a priority at all. Yeah. But it's just good to see that he's thinking about it the right way. So hopefully more people are looking at it like that, but it just doesn't, I don't know. Again, there's a lot in Washington that I just don't have any high hopes for what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to be clear, I don't view anyone who's arguing for less weapon sales to Taiwan as an enemy. I mean, certainly that's a position that I wouldn't necessarily disagree with, but as an end goal, trying to get towards zero, that's what I would advocate. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/Stitch Fix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at Pat McFarlane_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. So, yeah, I think we touched on that pretty well. Are there any other like bright burning issues in U.S.-China relations that you can think of?
Well, not so much. I mean, this is all related, but just how the U.S. is trying to build up with the one thing that's interesting, a story that's on antiwar.com today, is that Papua New Guinea, the prime minister, this little Pacific, actually, it's not that small compared to other Pacific island nations, but it's very close to Australia. It's super rural. People live in like the jungles and tribes. And the prime minister said the other day that, we don't want to get caught between the U.S. and China. And he said that he told President Biden while he was in Washington that, your enemy is not my enemy. Like, don't get us involved in this. And I think that that's something we're going to see with these Pacific nations kind of realizing, and with the Southeast Asian nations, if they're forced to make a choice between the U.S. and China. Australia is also a big factor because Papua New Guinea's right there. So they might have to side with Australia, but they don't want to make this choice. They don't want any of this to happen. So I think their opposition to it, Indonesia's opposition to it, which is a huge country, huge population, is something we could hope for, maybe to slow things down at least, of what the U.S., the goals that they have over there.
Yeah, it's very concerning. In the next few years, I mean, you just wonder exactly how the next 10 years are going to play out. And one thing, I guess, to zoom the focus back out a little bit, or to pull out a little bit, is to just see the Biden administration escalating tensions across the board. I mean, it seems like in North Korea, we've returned to a very tumultuous situation there, a very tight, tense situation there. We have this, like, almost, I want to say maximum pressure, but that's with Iran, isn't it? But with China, we have this very aggressive great power competition, and things seem like they're escalating with Israel and Iran. And then we have the war in Ukraine, and the U.S., it seems like, diverging with Europe, that our interests are no longer, I mean, it seems that's a whole nother can of worms, but it seems like maybe the long play was to cut off Europe's dependence on Russia and bring them closer to the U.S. In a way that doesn't necessarily make sense for Europe to go down that pathway. But what are your thoughts just on everything, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it is, like you said, it's just everywhere they're stoking tensions. With North Korea, there's no sign that they're going to back down on the policy of they just added new sanctions on them. I mean, they don't do anything at this point because North Korea is under so many sanctions. All it really does is just ensure that tensions are going to stay high. And then with Iran, and you have this really hawkish government coming in under Netanyahu, when this coalition he's forming is looks really bad. I mean, he's putting settlers, extremist settlers that live in the West Bank that want to cleanse it of Palestinians. He's putting them in charge of the West Bank policies of construction and demolition of Palestinian homes. So, if they really ramp that up, kind of this de facto annexation of the West Bank, that's also just going to raise tensions in not just there, but also just in the region. So and we'll see. I don't see the Biden administration standing up to Israel's new government. And with Iran, I mean, they just practiced bombing Iran, the U.S. and Israel, and they're saying that they support the protesters. They're probably giving them material support, trying to help them get around internet censorship and stuff, and threatening to attack their nuclear weapons program. I mean, this is Biden's, Iran envoy, who's been threatening that they'll use a military option as a last resort against Iran. And then, that's just besides everything that's going on in Ukraine with Russia. I mean, Blinken just said yesterday that they support Ukraine's goal of driving Russia out of Crimea, which is just an unrealistic goal. It's just going to ensure that this war just drags on. And Ukrainian civilians are just, living in the dark right now with no heat. They want to act like Ukraine is winning, but the people of Ukraine are not winning. I mean, they're really suffering, and a lot of them are dying in the fighting. They captured some territory, but I mean, at what cost? I mean, and when this is all said and done, the real tragedy of it is that unless, Russia somehow, which is, this is just totally unrealistic, but I guess this is Ukraine's view, is that somehow they can defeat Russia and, Putin will be defeated, and that won't end in a nuclear strike or just total chaos. But what's going to happen is that, if this war drags on for a few more years, eventually there's going to be some kind of settlement. And I wouldn't be surprised if Ukraine ends up without the Donbass, without Crimea, without some areas of Kherson and Zaporizhia, and, all of this fighting and killing and dying and they're going to end up worse off than they were before the war, when they could have made a deal if the U.S. and NATO just backed off and let a deal happen, or pushed Ukraine to just, make nice with Russia. But instead, this war is just going to keep dragging on, and so many people are going to die, and just for nothing. I mean, really, it matters to Ukrainians now because they were invaded by Russia. But, they couldn't do this without U.S. support. They say that themselves. So we're completely fueling this war that's just going to end up in some territory still being under the control of Russia at the end of the day.
And I think that the one circle I can't really square is that, and I think it's been 9 months since the Russian invasion has happened. It seems like the collective West has depleted all of their weapons in terms of the surplus amount, at the very least, probably has bled into their actual for use for their own military. And it seems like the U.S. has largely, especially in terms of artillery rounds, has depleted a lot of their stockpiles. How do they imagine that they can escalate on all these different areas, fight these proxy wars, try to fuel a proxy war in what could be a proxy war in Taiwan, and then still confront China or Russia if it were actually to devolve into a kinetic conflict? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's the thing. It doesn't make any sense. And I just don't get it. Like, is it as simple as just the corruption of, the military industrial complex and the weapons makers and the defense contractors just creating this policy so they're making as much money as they possibly can, which they are right now. They're making money on replenishing the stockpiles, selling weapons to Ukraine, selling weapons to Europe, modernizing weapons. Like, it's just a total boondoggle for them. But yeah, it doesn't make sense. If you were really concerned about Russia and China, like, even from the empire perspective, what is happening right now isn't sustainable. Driving Russia and China together is a big mistake. Russia's clearly not a threat to the United States. And I remember in the beginning of the Biden administration, there was some reports. There was one in Politico that said there was a small faction in the Biden administration that thought they should make nice with Russia to focus on China, even within the Biden administration. And that is kind of like what the realist view is, which makes more sense. It makes a lot more sense. If you do think China is this big threat that you have to contend with, why are you wasting all these resources on Ukraine, on the Donbass? Who controls the Donbass? Like, there's no strategic value for it. So maybe it is just, to make money for Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin. But I don't know. It's also tough to believe that it's that simple, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And there's puzzle pieces missing, and you try to imagine what they are, but you don't know what they are, and it's difficult to see the whole picture without those pieces missing. But you get a general idea, I think. And another thing I wanted to ask you about was in the near term, there have been people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, talking about a Russian offensive, a large-scale Russian offensive once the ground freezes, presumably this December, probably in the next couple weeks, if not after Christmas. I don't want you to play fortune teller, but I mean, what do you think would happen if that happened, if the Russians did have a large invasion?
I mean, I think if that is Russia's plan, you know, and they're going to try to push back further into Ukraine this winter. I mean, I do think Ukraine's armed forces have taken a lot of losses. I don't know how well they would be able to hold off Russian invasion, but I mean, I think it would just drag the war out. I mean, I don't think at this point, I don't know what it would take for Zelensky or the U.S. to change their mind and really push for negotiations. I do think Ukraine is just going to be slowly destroyed. And it's a real shame. But yeah, I mean, beyond that, I just think, you know, it'll kind of just continue this cycle that'll just say, oh, we have to give them more support now.
Right. Yeah. And I know you're not a military specialist, but have you seen any evidence of actual Russian troop buildups, like equipment and troop buildups to support an offensive?
I'm not sure. I mean, I know that they've been sending reinforcements in since they mobilized, 300,000 fresh troops, and that they are really reinforcing all their lines. So that could mean an offensive is coming. I think for a little while there, at least over the past few months, when there was more talk about diplomacy, and you had Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, say now is the time for talks. I think Russia might have been sitting back, but they're still building up their lines, and kind of just bombing the infrastructure, just trying to get Ukraine to say, all right, let's talk. And that was, that's not just my assessment. There's this American guy, I forget his name, but he's an advisor to the Ukraine's commander in chief, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. And he said that recently, that's what they think Russia was trying to do with all these infrastructure bombings, to force negotiations. And what he said was to get back to the 2014 lines, which would mean Russia would pull out of the territory it just annexed, which I have a hard time believing. But that's what this guy said, who's, super pro-Ukraine, obviously. So maybe there was some truth to that. But now, nothing has changed. And we've seen Ukrainian attacks now deep inside Russian territory. On Monday, there was, hundreds of miles inside Russia, drone attacks. So I think, we're probably going to see a big Russian escalation, both in the bombing of the infrastructure and in some kind of offensive that's probably coming soon.
You have to wonder too what the end game would look like for Russia because I mean, I think it makes the most sense for them to decisively win this war as quickly as possible. I mean, I think that from a militarist point of view, that should be your goal always. And if they are going to do some kind of further invasion, that there's going to be a rump state in Ukraine. And I know, like, Scott has always asked this question from the beginning of what is the end game? Is there a rump state in Ukraine? I heard someone mention, I don't know if it was on the Duran or something like that, Alexander Mercury's talking about maybe Poland taking the rump state over and Ukraine just ceasing to exist. Have you heard anything about that? I don't know.
I've heard those theories about Poland trying to take parts of Ukraine, but I don't see that happening. I mean, who knows though? But there's also a possibility that Russia kind of maybe the territory that they have now, they just secure it as much as possible, and because they have their corridor to Crimea, and they still have most of Kherson and Zaporozhye and the Donbass. I think they would definitely want to finish the Donbass, take over that whole region. Then maybe after that, kind of just draw a line and say, all right, we're done, ceasefire, and it could turn into like a frozen conflict.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the most likely scenario, that it is going to be frozen. Russia's going to remain a pariah of the West and under sanctions, and Ukraine is going to be destroyed, but rebuilding its military as a NATO military, and Russia's still going to like bomb them frequently, so it's just going to be a bad situation no matter what. I don't see a good ending to this. And that's something Mearsheimer, because I think he is very perceptive on what's happening in Ukraine. When he was asked in a recent interview he did, do you see a ceasefire diplomacy? He's like, no, we're screwed. It's pretty much what he said. And the risk, we haven't even really talked about the risk of escalation into nuclear war.
Right.
Because if, say, Ukraine does make some more successful counteroffensives, with the help from NATO and the U.S., and because during this winter pause, they're really training and trying to get more troops. And, there's all these rumors that there's a lot of like Poles fighting in Ukraine, a lot of people from NATO countries as mercenaries, but really it's kind of NATO troops. If that gets more reinforced and they are actually more successful than we expect, then, there's just always a risk of a big Russian escalation.
Yeah, definitely. It is scary. And even this idea of a frozen conflict just makes me think, we're going to revisit this in, 8 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe less.
Yeah. It's just, don't see a good scenario.
Yeah. Well, I think, I
don't know if there's a chance for this, unless, Zelensky, gets in trouble and somebody tries to take him out within Ukraine. Maybe a regime change in Kiev would change things. But who knows? Maybe the U.S. would be behind it because they would want somebody
out or somebody more reliable.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think he has pissed them off a lot lately.
I could see why.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Ukrainians themselves start to wake up and see their country just being destroyed and decide to rebel in a way and sue for peace. But of course, it's not, none of this ends well for Ukrainians. And that's really an unfortunate part of it too.
Yeah. They're the ones that are, getting the worst end of the stick here.
Yeah. And the other part of it is, and I think, I'll let you get going here, but the last thing to bring up is all these weapons ending up all over the place. And I think you reported they were ending up in Africa and also Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, or was it the Netherlands?
So that was Nigeria's president said this the other day, that weapons from Ukraine are ending up in the region, in the Lake Chad region, and ending up in the hands of terrorists. And then there was also Finnish law enforcement that said, weapons were turning up in Finland, and I believe it was also Sweden, Denmark, a few other countries in the region, which, isn't a surprise at all. But, there's also this big push among Republicans now, even kind of the more hawkish ones are saying, yeah, we should have more oversight of these weapons. So, I guess that's good, but it is kind of a double-edged sword, because the Pentagon has also used it to, they have inspectors, weapons inspectors inside Ukraine now, U.S. military personnel, inside the country in the name of oversight. So it could also kind of increase U.S. involvement. Of course, what we really want is to end sending the aid to Ukraine altogether. But I guess the concerns for oversight maybe are good, because it could expose things like weapons ending up in different places. So we'll see.
Yeah, it'll give Scott a lot of good footnotes.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, Dave. Well, it's really great to see you again, man. And you just want to remind people where they can find your work?
Yeah, you could antiwar.com. You can follow me on Twitter at DeCamp Dave. And then the show, it's on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble if you want the video. Most people listen to the audio version, which you could download wherever you listen to podcasts. So go check that out.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, I wanted to remind everyone too is that the Libertarian Institute is doing their winter fundraiser, and you should go on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate. You can see all the different tier levels. We are a 501c3, so you can write it off on your taxes. And we have a signature t-shirt that's only available for this fundraising season that you should check out there as well. So, well, thanks again, Dave. Keep up the good work, man. It's always good to see you.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.